Hi, and welcome to the Friendly City Books podcast. I'm your host today, Carter, and today I'm joined by Joseph Thompson. Hi, Joseph.
Hello, Carter. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, no problem. If you don't already know, Dr. Joseph M. Thompson is an assistant professor at Mississippi State University. He received his BA in American Studies and Anthropology from University of Alabama, a master's degree in Southern Studies from the University of Mississippi, and a master's degree in the United States history from the University of Virginia. He was awarded his PhD in U.S. history from Virginia in 2019. His book, Cold War Country, which I have a pre-release copy right here, how Nashville's Music Row and the Pentagon created the sound of American patriotism, which traces economic and symbolic connections between popular music and the U.S. military during the Cold War. Cold War Country places particular focus on country music industry's role in military recruitment since World War II to show how the relationship between genre and militarism helped create the sonic and political color lines of the late 20th century. Cold War Country comes out on April 2nd, and I'm really looking forward to the publication day and celebration with Friendly City Books. If you are around Columbus on Tuesday, April 2nd, please join us at Munson and Brothers Trading Post at 6 p.m. For Joseph to talk and some country music trivia. Things that I took away from Cold War Country. I thought it was a great look kind of behind the curtain to the country music industry during kind of the formation and rise of country music. And for me personally, it was very thought-provoking because I am actually an Air Force pilot. So I see a lot of military institutions from the inside. And so I enjoyed learning about how the military worked in and around and through, some of these cultural movements in history. This intertanglement of country music and the military still kind of comes through today, because I can recall way back in 2010, I was going through Air Force officer field training and at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama, during the summer between sophomore and junior years of college. And the last day before graduation, they took us out on this huge formation run. It was a hot, sticky June morning, and at the end, the run ended at the headquarters of Air University, which was the original building, the Air Corps Tactical School. So it's very old, and a large monument to the original Air Corps insignia, the prop and wings. At that, they handed all of us a prop and wings insignia pin. And while they're going through all the cadets, there was music playing. And what was it? It was country music, of course. Very specifically, I remember 3 songs. God Bless the USA by Lee Greenwood, American Soldier, and Courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue by Toby Keith. Learning, the history behind like how those songs ended up ingrained in my memory forever was very fascinating. So, Joseph, how did you end up focusing on this topic?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me say I'm glad to hear that story. I'm hearing that story often from as I go around to conferences or as people have actually started to read the book with some early copies getting out there. It's something that sort of validates my research for me, is to hear people to come up and say, yeah, I was Toby Keith played a concert at our installation, or this kind of thing. And all that to say, I came up with this topic really in a roundabout way. I've long been interested in sort of the politics of the U.S. South and how it is that, particularly in the time period that I grew up in, which was 80s and 90s, I grew up in a small town in North Alabama, not far from Huntsville, which, as many people probably know, was largely, much of it was built, its economy is kind of built on defense spending, with Redstone Arsenal and lots of engineers and contractors there. And so I grew up in a time where I was hearing a kind of Southern politics and U.S. politics that was kind of denouncing big government. And at the same time, I'm looking around and seeing that big government has built a lot of the landscape around me, and it really supports the economy around me. And so, even as a kid, that this kind of paradox fascinated me. When was it okay for people to accept versions of the U.S. government, and what versions were okay to accept, etc. Um, and so when I went to graduate school, I knew that I wanted to try to figure out that question. Um, and maybe this was the wrong way to go about it, but I'm a cultural historian by training. And music is my primary field of study. So I took the really kind of roundabout way of answering a political question with through a cultural lens, which is not advisable, really, if you want to get a dissertation to book done really, quickly. Because of what I ended up having to do was really dig into archives in ways that I think maybe hasn't always people haven't approached in the same way. So I ended up reading military archives for musical and trying to answer musical questions with military archives, and answering military questions in musical archives. So it's this kind of, because of this kind of back and forth between those two, I was able to kind of start getting at this question. But I haven't really answered your question yet, which is to say, how did I get into country music and the military?
Right.
Well, I started researching this because I study music. I was researching this black country music singer from Senatobia, Mississippi, named O.B. McClinton. And if people
Oh,
aren't
I
familiar
remember
with,
him in
yeah,
the book.
yeah.
Yeah.
So if people aren't familiar with O.B. McClinton, I highly recommend checking him out. I was fascinated with, he was someone who recorded in the late 60s, early 70s, and really all through the mid 80s until his untimely death um, in the mid 80s. And I was fascinated with him as a black Southerner singing country music. People always know Charlie Pride, but there's a lot more to this story of race and country music, as people are finding out these days, particularly as Beyonce hits the charts with her country music,
Absolutely.
right? People
Yep.
are starting to think about this. Well, I was thinking about this back in 2015, 2016. And when I was researching O.B. McClinton, I found out that he was recording, well, number one, that he had joined the Air Force in the mid 60s. And that after he gets out of the Air Force, he starts recording these country music recruitment shows. And so I'm like, country music recruitment shows, what is that? Well, come to find out, there are literally hundreds of episodes of these country music recruitment radio shows, dozens of television programs. And so this kind of opened up a whole world to me. And I realized that this was kind of a stepping stone into answering that political question that I started out this rambling answer with, which is, how is it that people are okay with certain forms of the federal government, federal spending? We all know the Lee Greenwoods and Toby Keiths of country music, but how did this come to be? Was this just something that's kind of implanted on, country music fans' DNA or something like that? And the answer is no. Cultural questions don't just spring from people organically like that. It often evolves from different kinds of relationships. And so, in digging into this and trying to figure out, O.B. McClinton's story, this just opened a whole world to me.
Well, yeah, no, I remember the part about O.B. McClinton. I was like, oh, yeah, okay, that makes sense. That's interesting that he was the first one that really spurned it off for you. But yeah, no, I like it. But so for me, as someone, I also enjoyed the very interesting interplay that the American military radio kind of put into everything, because
Sure.
I've been to a lot of the large overseas American military installations, and the radio networks kind of intrigued me because it's like this weird thing, like you're an ocean away from the US, but you're
Yeah.
spreading influence on some foreign land under the guise of kind of entertainment for the troops, right?
Right.
But because it's radio, anybody can listen to it that's close enough to the transmitter. I not that long ago, I've been in taxi cabs in Germany where they're listening to the armed forces radio. And you know that country music even described themselves as best liked worldwide, due to these tie-ins with the military. Do you think that American radio also was a contributing factor spreading other American cultural phenomenons during the Cold War? Like, I remember there's all kinds of stuff about jeans in Berlin during the Cold War. Do you happen to have anything on that?
Yeah, I focus on country music because for
Right.
me it helped answer this kind of political question that I was referencing. Um, but yes, I mean the American military, especially the AFRTS or AFARTs, I know as people in the service refer to it. Yeah, I mean it's spreading anything that is kind of happening in terms of popular music, popular culture, and being transmitted through that media is definitely spreading to these civilian listeners. I mean, and I think we would, of course, realize, that uh, some of the bigger stars that we think of, particularly by the '80s, like Michael Jackson and these kinds of people are getting a boost because they're getting radio play all over the world in this way. But this is something that people within the country music industry figured out very early on in the 1950s and kind of hitched their wagon to it, so to speak. And you referenced that slogan, "Best Liked Worldwide." That is the slogan of the Country Music Association when they form in 1958, 59, and really start to get things off the ground. And the CMA, which is obviously still around today and very powerful in terms of kind of boosting the popularity of country music. We're all familiar with the CMA awards, right? It starts out as
Mhm.
this small organization that's able to function as a chamber of commerce for country music,
Mm.
as it's referred to. In other words, it's kind of boosting the profile, cleaning up the image, connecting country music with business opportunities so that it can grow its brand at a time that it really sort of needs the help. It's doing that with a lot of different sectors of the economy. I mean, they're making sure that pet milk commercials have country music in them in order to kind of sell it that way. But the U.S. Armed Forces is another one of those business partners in this way. And so they're creating these public service announcements, these recruitment campaigns that I referenced earlier, and all of that's great for the CMA because yes, they've created the slogan at the beginning, "Best Liked Worldwide," but that's really an aspirational slogan when they start. They're really they have big dreams,
Okay.
uh, and if they can grow their popularity around the world, whatever way they can do it, they will. And the U.S. Armed Forces is obviously the most powerful way to do that at this point. Yeah.
Well, and then even like going back before the CMA was formed, you talk about how the army kind of accidentally fell into this idea of using country performers with Farron Young. They drafted him, and he had just
hmm
happened to have recorded a record that ended up kind of blowing up after he entered the service, and then they kind of like were like they took him and was like, "You're ours now. Play for the soldiers, please."
Right. Yeah. That's an important point, Carter, because I think when people see the title of my book and kind of hear the general sketch of what it's about, they might imagine sort of people in the Pentagon sort of twirling their mustache, saying, "Hey, we're going to get these, country music fans into the military," and it's nothing. At least from my research, it's nothing as conspiratorial or as nefarious as that. Um, in the 1950s, the Pentagon, the Defense Department, very much needed more recruits, and
Mhm.
so they were casting a wide net in order to do that. And country music was by no means the only kind of music that they were using. But and as you suggest, they kind of fall into this relationship with country music. Yeah, Farron Young is drafted in. late 1952. By early 1953, he's got his first top 10 hit. And so the U.S. Army realizes, oh, we've drafted this kind of up and coming star, right? Let's see what we can do with him. Now, around the same time, the U.S. Army and Air Force Recruiting Service has created these television programs in order to boost recruitment. One of them is called Talent Patrol. So imagine American Idol, or the Arthur Godfrey show, if for older listeners out there, except that it's all service members, right? And so
Right.
the idea was, we'll show how kind of down home and talented our service members are through this. And this kind of, it boosts the profile of the military. It seems like something sort of family friendly, something maybe you yourself would want to be involved in, right?
Right.
Well, and on one of these episodes of Talent Patrol, which was a competition, Farron Young wins. Well, he's kind of a ringer because he's been
Right.
honing his his singing chops for a few years at that point, and was basically a professional musician, or was a professional musician by that point. And so he wins, and they put him out on the road, going kind of installation to installation, and also making lots of appearances on the Grand Ole Opry, all the time boosting his profile as a soldier, making advertisements, particularly for the U.S. Third Army, which he was a part of, stationed in Fort McPherson and Atlanta. And he was also appearing on these radio recruitment shows where he would play a few songs and then make a pitch to join the U.S. Army, and then play a few more songs. And within 15 minutes, you're in and out of this recruitment spot. And from that point on, they realize that this is a sort of winning formula. They note that, we have a lot of white guys from the Southeast who seem to like country music, and there seems to be a pipeline of them coming into the military. Let's make sure we keep that pipeline flowing. We give them what they want in terms of these cultural productions. And so we get this relationship with the country music industry growing really from that point on.
Yeah. So who would you think benefited the most from kind of this arrangement? The military, Music Row in Nashville, or the individual artist?
Hmm. I would say that Music Row itself did.
Okay.
The individual artists kind of come and go. You know what? I'm going to revise that on the fly. I think
Okay.
at the beginning of this relationship in the 50s and 60s, it's Music Row that really benefits the most. And then I would say by the 1980s, it becomes an individual artist story,
Mm,
who can benefit from it. And the reason that I think that is because by the 1980s, we have the drop off of these recruitment programs. Also,
yeah.
by the 1980s, the demographics of the Army or the military have changed
Hmm.
quite a bit. Country music is no longer as popular as it was amongst soldiers, according to survey data from the 1980s. Soul music, R&B was most popular by the mid 1980s. And yet, at the same time, you have people like Lee Greenwood who are able to really build a career off of their version of patriotism. But to go back to the beginning of this, I would say it's the country music industry, particularly the CMA, because the CMA, they start handing out these kind of, I, I don't want to call them meaningless, but they start handing out these awards to different branches of the military, thanking them for their service, making a big to do of this at their award ceremonies, which is meaningful for a lot of people, right? Because military service is very serious, and it's very, very meaningful for people. It's very impactful on everyone's lives, particularly in times of war, right? So I don't want to say it doesn't really mean anything, but it's ceremonial, right? The
Right.
U.S. Air Force or Navy isn't looking for awards from the CMA, even though they send representatives to the CMA award shows and receive these, and say thank you, and we appreciate country music's role in our recruitment programs and this kind of thing. But while that's happening, particularly if you go back to the 1950s, the country music industry is kind of in a bit of a bind by the late 1950s, early 60s, because of the rise of rock and roll, they're kind of they've their radio play airtime has diminished quite a bit, and so they're looking for all these ways to kind of boost the profile of country music and boost its popularity. And so by saying, "Hey, we are the patriotic genre. We are the all-American genre. In fact, we are the music of America," which is one of the ways that they branded country music. The CMA branded country music. They're able to really kind of clean up the image of country music as not something for hillbillies, quote unquote, but something that is respectable, very much in line with the Cold War politics of Middle America. And so in that regard, I think the CMA is the one who and by extension, Music Row are the ones who are really able to receive the most benefit at the beginning.
Okay. Yeah, I think this kind of leads into my next thing because we had this thing going on, an essentially almost peacetime draft. They kept the draft going after Korea and through Vietnam, where everyone was getting drafted for at least 2 years. So going into that, like Elvis was famously drafted in 1958, and he's like at this time super famous, kind of in the rockabilly, rock and roll kind of, you know, kind of genre. And but during his service, the army did not try to use him at all for anything, and kind of almost squirreled him away to Germany for 2 years, where he just kind of like, I wouldn't necessarily say he lived a quiet life, but it kind of out of the spectacle for then. Like, why did the army not lean on Elvis as a recruiting tactic instead of just shipping him off to Germany for 2 years?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that I kind of struggled with because for a couple of reasons. One, well, for the listeners and viewers, I suppose, you might be wondering why is Elvis even in a music in a book about country music, right? And so one of the reasons I wanted to write about him was to show how embedded he was in the country music industry, how integral it was to his rise to fame. Long before he's the king of rock and roll, right? He's the folk
Hmm.
music fireball,
Right.
and all these kinds of these nicknames that he received from the country press. Because they saw him as one of their own, and why shouldn't he? He's playing country songs, albeit in this
Hmm.
kind of wild, rebellious way. People like the people on Music Row are often looking at him with a bit of suspicion, seeing him as a sort of internal threat to the staid sounds of country music at the time, or the acceptable sounds of country music at the time. And so, yeah, but he uses that country music industry all along the way to achieve his kind of first iteration of fame. But yes, so then in 1958, along comes the army and says, it's time to serve your time here. And according to my research, special services, which is the kind of entertainment branch of the U.S. Army, they didn't want anything to do with them because they felt
Right.
like his appeal was to teenage girls. And I'm
Oh,
paraphrasing a quote here, but it's something one of a special services officer said something about that's a demographic that we're really not interested in, right?
yeah. They
And
wouldn't be at that time.
Right, they wouldn't be, right? So they're not interested in drafting teenage girls excuse me, recruiting teenage girls or catering to their taste in any way. And he is at that point is still seen as such a kind of symbol of rebelliousness, of questionable morality, because of his dancing, his hair, and all the
Hmm.
things that we've come to love about Elvis. Is seen as a real threat to this kind of middle class respectability, and particularly the kind of moral standards that the U.S. military would want to imbue. So he's off limits. It's kind of like why it's not why wouldn't we use him? It's why would we use him right at this point? Um, and then of course this kind of magical transformation happens for him.
Yeah.
He's, as you say, he's kind of squirreled away in Germany for 2 years, And by the time he comes out, he's able to star in a film called GI Blues, which many people have probably seen. And it's essentially a recruitment film. And in fact, it's made with the full cooperation of the Defense Department, as it says on a credit on a card at the beginning of the film. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
this is quite the transformation. So for me, as a cultural historian, I had to figure out what to do with that.
Yeah.
How does this kind of fit into the story that I'm telling? And what I kind of came to realize was that, well, of course, we know that he came out the other side of the army, this kind of clean cut version of himself. People say that it ruined Elvis. That he becomes this kind of sanitized pop star, matinee idol. And I want to kind of reclaim Elvis's transformation here and say, well, that doesn't ruin him. It just did for him what the army had promised to do for all of these recruits, right? It
Oh yeah.
cleans them up. It gives them kind of order in their life. It puts them
Mm-hmm.
onto a path for more success in their civilian career once they get out of the army. That's exactly what happened to Elvis, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, in fact, I would say he's not, extraordinary in any means, but he's very ordinary in his army experience in that regard.
Well, no, and you also make the argument for other big artists that came up through that time, like Johnny Cash, right? Like
Sure.
very similar kind of thing. Like Johnny Cash goes to the military to kind of get out and away and get something, and then leaves the Air Force, you know, after honing his musical talents, and now is able to springboard into his musical career, kind of.
Absolutely. And, that's um, one of the challenges in writing this book I found was having to tell that some version of that story over and
Mm-hmm.
over again and in a way that hopefully didn't become slog or too boring for the reader, because it happens so much, right?
Yep.
It's a story that is just like just so repetitive at times because it's oh I maybe I knew a few chords on the guitar, then I joined the army, and because I was sitting around and didn't have much else to do, I started playing more and more music. There were these other country pickers from around the South often,
Mm-hmm.
who joined in with me. And before you knew it, we had a band. And before you knew that,
Yeah.
I was writing songs. And then I get out of the army and I transition to this career in country music more often than not. Yeah, and Johnny Cash is a prime example of that, right? He buys his guitar at a PX
Yep.
in Germany. That's the post exchange for folks who might not know. That's your military, the store on your military installations. Um, Buys a guitar there, starts fooling around with a tape recorder and some of his buddies. He has a little band called the Landsberg Barbarians, and they start playing around the barracks and around cafes and this kind of thing where they're stationed. And this really sets him on his way. He writes Folsom Prison Blues over there. He's writing I Walk the Line over there in Germany before he ever comes back home and tries to start a music career.
Yeah, and I also one other little tidbit. I never realized that Johnny Cash was over in Germany playing in, I think Bavaria, in little cafes and bars in Bavaria. That just was a
Right.
little bit wild
Yeah, you can imagine
to realize.
stumbling upon that in the 1953 or whatever.
Yeah,
Would have
yeah,
been a
yeah.
trip.
I mean, well, I've been in enough karaoke places in Germany. I think I have a similar issue, but I can't hold a tune to save my life. So that's neither here nor there. But just another segue, going back to Obi from Senatobi, who kind of like
Yeah,
set this whole thing off. I really appreciated, you had a few sections talking about the parallel going on with the African American artists that were
yeah,
also in the service and their contributions to music during that time, even if most of the time they weren't officially sponsored by the Army or the Defense Department. And I just want to point out that I thought this came as a great natural extension almost to the book that recently came out. I think it was last year, called Half American by Matthew
Hmm.
L. Delmont, which really greatly chronicled the African American experience during World War II.
Uh-huh.
Um, and so, with that, I think the best known example of a drafted African American musician was Jimi Hendrix. So, if the recruiting service had handled Jimi Hendrix like a lot of the country artists, what do you think that the differences in Jimi Hendrix's career might have been through the 60s, rather than him getting out of the army as soon as he could, hanging
Yeah.
around Clarksville until his buddy gets out, and then going from there, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of hard to imagine Jimi Hendrix like participating in a military recruitment campaign.
Yeah, it is.
Although his music was used later on, like, pre-recorded, album cuts of his were used on these compilations that were played on the radio for military recruitment. So it actually, and this would have been even after his death. So
Mhm.
in a weird way, he ended up doing that, but to your point, why wouldn't they kind of tap into these resources of Black musicians for entertainment and recruitment and whatnot? And to some extent, they did. There are instances of course, African American musicians playing in service members clubs, USO tours, and this kind of thing. But in terms of recruitment, they wouldn't have used Jimi Hendrix because they didn't have a
Yeah,
kind of R&B recruitment
right.
program in the early to mid '60s. That's not going to start until the 1970s. They end up coming up with some kind of soul music centric, R&B centric, um, and even rock and roll centric um, recruitment programs. But that doesn't come until the 1970s. So to think of him like playing on a show, it just wouldn't have even occurred to them, right? And in fact, this is one of the paradoxes that I explore in the book, is that at the very time that the military is integrating and dealing with its kind of internal racial struggles, and realizing that they have to deal with this in order to fully integrate and make it a place that is could be as equitable as possible, they're kind of doubling down on country music, which is often imagined as the kind of purview of white artists and fans. And so this is something that I try to tease out throughout the whole book, which is that as the military is using so much country music programming in their entertainment and recruitment, they're sort of branding the institution as a white institution through the use of this music. Now, this is by no means to suggest that only white uh, people listen to country music or play country music. Obviously, that's false, which is what one of the great things that Obie McClinton reveals, right?
Hmm.
But when these Defense Department and recruiting service programmers are using country music, they're not thinking about those nuances, right? They're seeing country music just for what it is in terms of its commercial viability in the 1960s, which would have been, white people's music. And so, yeah, it kind of strains the imagination to think of Jimi Hendrix playing along with some recruitment programming. It just wasn't on the agenda at the time.
Yeah, exactly. And then he writes songs like "Hey Joe" or
Right.
whatever.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean,
Machine Gun.
but
Right. Yeah.
the par I mean, that paradox has gone like million miles, because what are they Fortunate Son by Creedence Clearwater Revival kind of becomes like this, like, for whatever reason people think it's a very super patriotic song, but you listen to the lyrics, they're avoiding the draft. They don't want to go
Sure.
to Vietnam, right? So
Well, and calling out the hypocrisy, they're calling out the
yeah.
kind of class warfare happening within
Hmm.
the recruitment and drafting during Vietnam. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those. It's one of those songs that gets so kind of pegged with the Vietnam War, particularly because it's so often
Hmm.
used in movies about the war and documentaries about the war. And this
Yep.
is another thing that I found interesting in the research is we often think of that kind of music be it Jimi Hendrix, Creedence Clearwater, or whatever, as like the sound of Vietnam, and then maybe
Hmm.
by extension the sound of the U.S. military in the late 1960s. And
Right.
I'm telling a very different story,
Yep.
um, because that is not what the historical record reveals. Now obviously there are different experiences within the military. For the people fighting on the ground in Vietnam, yeah, it might have been Jimi Hendrix and Creedence Clearwater that was the soundtrack to their service. And indeed, by all accounts, it was, right. I mean, Craig
Hmm.
Warner's great book about this is kind of a classic, or a modern classic on this. Um, but at the same time, that's not the entirety of the military experience during Vietnam, right? Another way of serving is being stationed on a base in Germany, and
Hmm.
you know what you're going to hear there is not probably Creedence Clearwater Revival. You're going to be hearing country music, at least by all accounts that I've found. To the extent that by 1968, it's almost 70% of the records sold in the European PXs are country music records. That's a very different kind of soundtrack than we're used to imagining military life in the 1960s.
Yeah, that's just a huge stat of that. So kind of going into like the research, what was probably like the furthest, like, I don't know, place you had to dig into to like really research this? Like, did you physically have to go places, or I'm just curious as to like kind of how
Yeah,
that went down?
yeah. So I kind of my two main archives were the National Archives in College Park. Historians call it Archives 2. So there's the main archives in Washington,
Yeah.
D.C., and then there's Archives 2 out in College Park. That's where a lot of the military records that I used came from. So that was kind of one of my central archives. The other was in Nashville at the Country Music Hall of Fame
Okay.
and museum there. They have something called the Frist Library and Archives there. And it is a gold mine for people researching country music history. And so at the beginning when we started talking, I was saying I was reading military archives for
Hmm.
evidence of music, and music archives for evidence of the military. And so those are my kind of two big ones. Now branching off from that, I also made archive trips to Tulane, to Kennesaw State University, to Georgia State University, University of Texas, smaller archives like the Anniston Public Library in Anniston, Alabama. That was one. That was actually another one of the early entries into this topic. Besides O.B. McClellan, was I was interested in the attack on Nat King Cole in
Yeah.
1956 in Birmingham, which I've only
Hmm.
mentioned briefly in the book.
Yeah. No,
Um,
I remember that.
yeah, but that by researching that, that was one of the first things that I did that really turned me on to this idea of studying music and the military at the same time. Because when I was researching that attack, which I think I can't remember if I said it was 1956, right? Some white
Hmm.
supremacists tried to kidnap Nat King Cole, who was arguably the biggest singer at the time in the United States. They tried to rush on to the stage and attack Nat King Cole. Well, I started digging into their kind of ideology, and I was reading their newsletters, right? And I actually included a couple of images from it in the book. It was called The Southerner. These white supremacists were part of something called the White Citizens Council, which many people are probably familiar with if you're familiar with civil rights history at all. Um, and they saw these kind of internal rebellions happening within the South, and they saw this as a threat to the white racial dominance of the South. And those two were rock and roll, um,
Hmm.
and or black music in general, primarily rock and roll, and the integration of the military. Because Anniston is located next to Fort McClellan, or Fort McClellan is located next to Anniston, where these guys were from, they were incensed that this was this kind of island of integration happening just not far from their town, right? And not only were there black men and white men living together there, working together there,
Mm-hmm.
enjoying recreation together there. But it was also the home of the WACs, the Women's Army Corps. So you
Mm-hmm.
have white women, black men, all living together. This was kind of a nightmare come to life for these white supremacists, and they're writing about this in their newsletter. So this was actually early on, around the same time I was researching the OB from Senatobia. I was researching this too, and I thought, oh, this is another way this kind of connection between race, the military, and music is happening, and as I've told it here in Cold War country, it's all part of the same sort of story.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you, Joseph. I have one last question though, and it's a
Okay.
requirement on the Friendly City Books podcast. We ask every author, what are you reading right now?
Hmm.
Or what upcoming work are you most excited about? Fiction, nonfiction, it doesn't matter. No rules here.
Okay. What am I reading? Let me figure out because I've got like 4 books going at any one time. So what do I want to tell you that I'm reading? One is a biography of Harry Smith called Cosmic Scholar by John Swed. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but
I am not.
that's one I'm really enjoying at the moment. And yeah, and I should have read this already in my life, so this is sort of an embarrassing admission, maybe. But I'm also just started reading Robert Caro's *The Power Broker*, which won the
Okay.
Pulitzer. It's his
Yeah.
biography of Robert Moses, and it's only about 1,200 pages, and I just started it. So
Yeah.
it's my like summer project as I read 4 or 5 other books at any given time. So those are two.
All right. Fantastic. Joseph, again, thanks again. For those out there, Cold War Country, out April 2nd. And grab your copy at Friendly City Books. Come join us at Munson and Brothers, April 2nd, 6 p.m. If you're listening to this after that, sorry you missed it. You're going to have to try again some other time. But once again, Joseph, thanks again. And we're excited for everyone else to read this.
Well, thank you so much, Carter. I appreciate the time and I appreciate you reading the book. And yeah, come out to Munson and Brothers and we'll compete at some country music trivia. You'll probably beat me. So
I know you're definitely gonna beat me, but we'll let the chips fall where they may on Tuesday. All right.
all right, sounds great. Thanks so much.
Yeah, you're welcome, and thank you for listening. And happy reading. Views and opinions expressed by the host are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the view of the United States Air Force, Department of Defense, or any of its officials.